You've probably never thought about it, but somewhere in the back of a museum storage room right now, there's a piece of ancient linen or papyrus that a woman folded and used exactly the way you'd use a pad, thousands of years before pads existed. She did this without a single product, without a store, without anyone even willing to talk about it openly. And somehow, this basic biological reality, something roughly half of all humans throughout history have dealt with monthly for decades of their lives, barely shows up in the historical record at all. That absence is the story. Not because it wasn't happening, because almost nobody wrote it down. Let's start with what we actually do know, because there's more evidence than you'd expect if you know where to look. In ancient Egypt, one of the oldest surviving medical documents in human history, a text called the Kahun Gynaecological Papyrus, dates back to around 1800 BCE and deals specifically with women's reproductive health. It's one of the earliest known medical texts devoted to a single organ system, and menstruation, along with fertility and pregnancy, sits right at the center of it. The papyrus contains a whole series of diagnostic questions and remedies, attempting to categorize different reproductive complaints and match them to specific treatments, which tells you Egyptian physicians were already thinking about menstrual health as a distinct, structured medical category rather than something vague or unspeakable. Egyptian women are believed to have used softened papyrus, essentially the same plant material used for writing, rolled or folded into an absorbent material. Some historical accounts also point to the use of soft linen, a fabric Egypt produced in enormous quantities and one they were already using for nearly everything else, from clothing to mummification wrappings, meaning the raw material for menstrual management was already sitting in nearly every Egyptian household. Here's the detail that tends to surprise people the most. This wasn't treated as universally shameful in ancient Egypt the way it became in many later cultures. Egyptian religious and medical texts describe menstrual blood with a surprising mix of practical acknowledgement and even some believed medicinal uses, occasionally referenced in remedies for other ailments, from skin conditions to protective charms. That doesn't mean there was no stigma at all, but the level of fear and secrecy that shows up so heavily in later historical periods wasn't uniform across every ancient culture. Context mattered enormously, and Egypt, at least in the surviving record, seems to have approached the subject with noticeably more clinical distance than the anxiety-driven framing that dominates later Greek and Roman sources. Ancient Greece told a very different story, and much of what we know comes from a massive body of medical writing called the Hippocratic Corpus, a collection of texts attributed to the school of Hippocrates. Classicist Helen King, who has spent much of her academic career specifically studying gynecology in ancient Greek medicine, argues in her research that Greek physicians viewed the female body almost entirely through the lens of the womb. According to Hippocratic theory, the womb was thought to be a semi-independent, almost restless organ that could wander through the body if a woman didn't menstruate regularly, causing what physicians called hysteria, a term that literally derives from the Greek word for womb. Under this framework, regular menstruation wasn't just a biological process, it was considered essential medical maintenance, a way of expelling what Greek physicians believed was excess, impure blood that built up in the body due to a woman's supposedly more porous, spongier flesh compared to men. If a young woman's periods hadn't started on schedule, Hippocratic texts sometimes recommended marriage and pregnancy specifically to correct the supposed imbalance, treating menstrual regularity as something a woman's whole social role should be organized around. King's work points out just how directly this medical theory reinforced existing social expectations. A woman's worth, her marriageability, and even her perceived sanity were all tied, in the medical literature of the time, back to the same underlying biological process. It's a striking example of how ancient medicine wasn't separate from ancient social expectations. They were often the exact same argument, just wearing different clothes. As for absorbent materials in Greece and later Rome, historical and archaeological evidence points to the use of softened wool, wrapped and folded to absorb flow, sometimes attached with a simple strip of cloth functioning much like a modern belt system. Wool was abundant, reusable after washing, and already a staple textile across the ancient Mediterranean, making it a practical, low-cost solution long before anyone thought to manufacture something specifically for this purpose. Rome inherited a lot of Greek medical thinking. But Roman writers took the mythology surrounding menstrual blood to an entirely new, almost bizarre extreme. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, in his sprawling encyclopedia Natural History, written in the 1st century CE, catalogued an astonishing range of supposed powers attributed to menstrual blood, some framed as dangerous, some framed as almost magical. Pliny claimed menstrual blood could dull the shine of mirrors, turn wine sour, kill entire swarms of bees, blunt the edge of steel blades, cause fruit to fall from trees prematurely, and even cause crops to wither if a menstruating woman walked through a field. Reading through the list today, it reads less like careful natural observation and more like an anxious society trying to explain an unpredictable biological process by assigning it almost supernatural destructive power, something bigger and more dangerous than ordinary human biology. At the same time, in a genuinely strange contradiction, other passages describe menstrual blood being used in folk remedies believed to cure various ailments, ward off certain diseases, or repel pests from crops and homes. The exact opposite framing from the destructive claims made just paragraphs earlier in the same text. Pliny doesn't seem to notice, or at least doesn't address, how contradictory these two framings actually are sitting side by side in the same work. This contradiction, feared as dangerous and yet occasionally sought out as powerful, shows up again and again across ancient cultures, and it tells you something important. Menstruation wasn't just misunderstood biologically. It became a canvas people projected enormous cultural anxiety onto, precisely because nobody fully understood what was actually happening in the body. Move outside the Mediterranean world and the picture shifts again. In many indigenous cultures across the Americas, parts of Asia, and sub-Saharan Africa, menstruating women were historically secluded during their periods, often in a dedicated structure sometimes referred to by anthropologists as a menstrual hut. These structures varied enormously in purpose and meaning, depending on the culture. In some of these traditions, the practice was rooted in beliefs about spiritual power, specifically tied to menstruation, occasionally viewed as something requiring careful containment rather than simple avoidance, a genuinely different framing than the purely negative impurity narrative that dominated many European and Mediterranean sources. Some anthropological accounts even describe menstrual seclusion, in certain cultural contexts, functioning as a form of built-in rest, a designated period where women were temporarily excused from strenuous daily labor, which complicates any simple narrative that frames every historical seclusion practice purely as punishment or shame. In other traditions, seclusion practices were tied more directly to restrictive taboos, limiting a woman's contact with food preparation, religious spaces, or community activities during her period, reflecting genuine fear or discomfort around menstrual blood rather than any framework of spiritual respect. Some of these taboo-based practices have persisted in modified or contested forms into the present day in certain regions, occasionally drawing modern public health scrutiny when seclusion practices compromise a woman's safety or access to basic resources. It's worth being careful here, because it's tempting to flatten thousands of distinct cultures into one simple narrative, and that's exactly the kind of oversimplification serious historians try to avoid. The reality is enormously varied. Some cultures treated menstruation with something closer to reverence. Many more treated it with restriction, fear, or outright taboo. And in nearly every case, whatever the underlying belief system was, actual practical management, meaning what women physically used to absorb or manage the blood itself, still had to happen, quietly, privately, and almost always without documentation, because the people writing history for most of human civilization were, overwhelmingly, men. And menstruation simply wasn't something considered worth recording in detail. That gap in the historical record is, in its own way, exactly the point. Historian Sara Read, who has extensively researched how menstruation was discussed and managed in later historical periods, has noted just how difficult it is to reconstruct these everyday practices precisely because they were rarely written about directly, even in eras with far more surviving documentation than the ancient world offers. Read's research often draws on indirect sources instead, things like personal letters, herbal remedy books, or legal records that mention menstruation only in passing while discussing something else entirely, forcing historians to piece together a picture from the margins of documents that were never actually about the topic itself. If educated women writing centuries later, women who could read, write, and had access to private diaries, still struggled to leave a clear, direct record of something so universal, you can imagine how much thinner that record gets the further back you go, into eras where far fewer women could write at all, and where the men recording history simply didn't consider the subject worth their attention. So what does this all add up to? Ancient women across wildly different civilizations were solving the exact same practical problem using whatever their environment gave them. Papyrus and linen in Egypt, wool in Greece and Rome, moss, grass, and soft plant fibers documented in various other regions throughout history, chosen based on whatever absorbent, accessible material happened to be available locally. The materials changed depending on geography and resources, but the underlying need never did. What also never really changed, disturbingly consistently, was the tendency for surrounding cultures to wrap that basic biological need in either intense mythology, medical misunderstanding, or outright secrecy. Whether it was Greek physicians blaming a wandering womb for a woman's entire emotional state, or Pliny insisting menstrual blood could sour wine and dull steel, ancient explanations for menstruation tell you far more about the anxieties of the societies writing them down than they tell you about the actual biology involved. Somewhere in that gap between what women were actually doing, quietly and practically, and what men were writing down, wildly and mythologically, an entire dimension of ancient daily life slipped almost completely out of the historical record. You've probably never thought about it, but that missing piece of history was happening every single month, in every single ancient civilization, to roughly half the population alive at any given time, and almost nobody thought it was worth writing down. The more we learn about the past, the better we understand ourselves. If this video sparked your curiosity, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow Phoenix Primeval for more fascinating stories from history, science, and human evolution. Thanks for watching.